Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about raiding in World of Warcraft Classic Fresh Season of Mastery, which to me seems to be one of the bigger focuses of Blizzard when it comes to Classic Fresh. They're going to buff the HP of bosses, they're going to remove world buffs, they're not going to change the item drop chances, even though we're going to have a shorter period of time to do the content and get our gear. There's a whole bunch of changes that Blizzard is making that are going to significantly affect rating, but how significantly? Well, this is what I'm here to talk about. First off is the HP change, and that's probably the most significant one of these changes. And it depends on how much HP we're talking about. Like if Blizzard gives it, let's say 10, 20, 30, even 50%, it's probably not going to be that significant, though if you add everything up, it does end up being having quite a bit of significance. But if they say double the HP of bosses, coupled with other things that they're doing, then things are going to be very, very different. And why is that? Obviously, we have a lot more power, people have better computers, better connections, communications, and these bosses were designed in an era where people just didn't have any of that, where communication, coordination was just lackluster, to say the least, or non-existent in many cases. The point is that these bosses are not capable of giving players a challenge in this day and age. So what Blizzard is doing with buffing bosses and then adding some mechanics that they may have removed on them, that's going to make things a lot more interesting, a lot more challenging. You won't just be able to trivialize mechanics as people were able to do during Classic. You won't just be able to trivialize mechanics by bursting them down 10, 20, 30 seconds flat. You will actually have to take minutes on each boss fight to deal with them. And that's great. That's a welcome development. That's a welcome change. For instance, on Ragnaros, you might actually have to deal with his sons. And to be clear, I don't think the vast majority of guilds actually had to worry about his sons spawning maybe a couple of times in Classic. That's how much power. Even when we went there early on, the idea of dealing with sons was laughable. So we have a situation where we're going to have to deal with mechanics where we won't just be able to trivialize bosses. Or fear, for instance, on Onyxia, or deep breaths on Onyxia, or doing Onyxia with 15 people in like week 2 or 3. Yeah, I think it was the third week that we did that in Dream State or something along those lines. That will no longer happen. Those kind of things will no longer happen. I'm sure some people are going to try and push it, and some people will manage it, but I'm talking here in general, people won't be able to get away with this kind of stuff. And that's good. That's great, because raiding shouldn't just be, oh, I spend so much time and effort and money getting all these consumables, getting all this world buff, getting all this gear, enchanting this gear, just so I smash through the raid content in like 20, 30, an hour flat. Like Molten Core in an hour, Onyxia in 10 minutes, something like that. There should be something that we actually strive for, something we fight for. And in Classic, with the exception of Naxxramas, that was completely lacking. Sure, there were plenty of pugs and horrible groups that could wipe in ZG, could wipe in Blackwing Lair, and other raid instances. But for any decent group, you would clear things pretty quickly and pretty efficiently. So, and that just comes down to them buffing the HP. To be clear, that's just one of those things. Then there's the decision to not improve the amount of items dropped, or to increase the loot table, the number of items on the loot table, how many, like saying getting 2 or even 3 tier items or something along those lines. That's not going to be the case in Classic Fresh. Now, to a degree, I think that's a mistake, and the reason I think that's a mistake from Blizzard's perspective is, yeah, sure, you're doing that, you're saying that you're doing that because you don't want people to be packed to the teeth in full best in slot from the previous tier just as the new one comes out, which is fair. That only really started happening towards the very, very end of TBC with Sunwell Plateau, which took close to a year from the release of Black Temple to the release of Sunwell Plateau, and then, of course, Wrath. Whereas for all of Vanilla and vast majority of TBC, we didn't have that. People would do Illidan in Tier 4. People would do Nax in Tier 2. Something along those lines. Basically, people would not have all this juicy best in slot gear. So gear mattered. It was of significant importance. The problem with this, there's a couple of problems with this. And I think that in this respect, Blizzard is not doing the right thing. But the problems with this are as follows. One, it's going to incentivize or significantly push people in the direction of split rating. Now, some people would say, oh, we would split rate all the same. Yes, you would. Some people would, or a lot of people would. But the difference would be fairly gigantic, even when you're accounting for that. There's going to be basically guilds that split raid versus guilds that don't split raid are going to have an enormous advantage. I mean, there still would be an advantage for split raiding, and it is a cancer on the raiding community that has existed since Wrath. Thank you, Blizzard, for that wonderful, wonderful expansion. It really brought about all the horrible things we're dealing with in WoW today. Believe it or not, all the issues that modern WoW has come from Wrath. The seeds were laid down in Wrath of the Lich King. But that's a whole different discussion that I can have at a later date. People who have watched my channel for a while know my distaste for Wrath. Just gonna leave it there. But point is, split raiding has been a cancer on the raiding community, and if you're not increasing the amount of loot dropped from bosses, or the chance of certain items that people care about, like a Curia, Onslaught, all that, if you're not doing that, then just people are gonna split raid, even if they have to create their own pugs, where they reserve stuff, or if they just organize the guild with alts. Now, I've never been fond of this. I hate World of Warcraft, and this is what that decision is going to lead to. More so than it did in Classic. I mean, it was already happening in Classic, it happens on Retail. But Blizzard did actually take actions. Like, on Retail, they realized to, I guess, a degree that it was an issue, and the way they've handled the loot, in many ways, is actually better. But the way they're, at least to Shadowlands, amusingly, at least to Shadowlands, for BFA and Legion, you have Titanforge and Warforge items ruining everything. But for Shadowlands, believe it or not, the loot is actually pretty damn solid. For the most part, there's still major issues, don't get me wrong. There's still things that need to improve, but it was a step in the right direction. Problem is, so split raiding, that's the first issue. The second issue, PvP. So you don't get items from raids, right? You have a limited pool of items. 40 people or 10, 20 people want that same items. Like, you have 10 warriors. They all want the same damn items. You have mages. You have healers. You have shamans. You have paladins. Priests. They all want the same items. You're looking at a lot of people competing for those items. Now, sure, it wouldn't be a great thing to just disenchant everything, right? And drop the price of every enchanting material in the game. But the point is, it's not a great place to be if you can't get items. So what do? You PvP. But they've said that the honor system is going to be in the game from the very start. And what the problem with that is, yeah, okay, you have the battleground system, you have the honor system. Great. That's actually good in itself. But when you couple that together with the fact that they're not increasing the amount of items dropped from raids, then you just end up in a situation where, hey, you either PvP or you GTFO, basically, or you're screwed. Because PvP items, even if we had higher drop chances or more items dropped from bosses, even if we had that, PvP items are still very, very powerful. So if they released items, they haven't actually talked on this subject. They've just said that they're releasing battlegrounds in the honor system. And I'm assuming, as are other people, that that's going to include PvP rewards. If they don't include PvP rewards from the start, okay, it's not going to be so much of an issue at the start, but it will be an issue even later down the line. It doesn't matter when they do it. If they're going to have limited items, then people will PvP. I mean, this was already a thing in vanilla, believe it or not. Like, people would PvP just to get all those rewards because they didn't have they didn't have better options. Unless the items dropped from raiding itself. So because of a lack of options, that's what people did. It's going to get a lot worse in Classic Fresh if they don't work on this issue, if they don't improve on this issue. So loot, the way they've stated that they're going to handle things is not great, and I feel that's going to have a detrimental impact. You could say it's going to make raiding more difficult, sure, but how you make something more difficult, difficulty for difficulty's sake has always been a piece of crap in every single game I've played. How you make something difficult is just as important as making things more difficult. Yes, people not having items, not being decked to the teeth and best in slot items is going to make things more challenging and the encounters more interesting because you just will lack that power, but it's going to have an enormously detrimental impact on the community from my perspective. Now, hopefully they change this. Hopefully they don't dig their heels in as they have been known to do, and they change their minds on this, but we don't know, really. We don't know what Blizzard's going to do. I think right now they're still trying to determine what they're going to do with Classic. Like, there's still changes that they want to implement. And obviously, we have a long way until we even get to the raid testing, right? We're just level 45. Maybe next week we get 60 and more experience bonus, so we'll see what happens then. Then there's the question, finally, the question of raid compositions. How is that going to look? Well, first off, with world buffs removed, warriors are no longer going to be the king of the hill. On that issue alone, just removing world buffs, which benefited warriors far more than anyone else, warriors are going to lose a significant amount of power. You're not going to see warriors doing 3k DPS in Classic Fresh, partly because of the length of the encounters, and in large part because of the removal of world buffs. So without world buffs, people have less power, warriors are not so important. I'm sure there will be still some raid compositions where people will stack 10 plus warriors, but I think for the most part, for a lot of guilds, they won't suffer so much if they don't have 10, 20 warriors in every raid, which certainly was the case in Classic. I mean, warrior being a popular class is not a horrible thing, by the way. It's a nice class to play, but it is ridiculous when you have a class that's in such in high demand. It's insane when half your raid potentially can be made up of one class. I mean, shamans can be ridiculous as well, and so can paladins, but nowhere near as ridiculous as warriors are in Classic. I don't think there's ever been a period in the history of the game, I could be wrong on this, but I don't think there's ever been a period in the history of the game where one class could make up half your raid in a 40-man. Like, even when we're when we're thinking about 25-man, right? I don't think there's ever been that situation. I mean, sure, there have been periods where certain classes have been significantly better than others and brought a lot more power to a raid, but nowhere near approaching the levels that warriors got in Classic. But what does that mean? What does having less warriors with less power? Well, maybe rogues are going to be more viable. Yes, in my eternal crusade against the rogues, I'm going to say that they're probably going to be in a better position in Classic Fresh because of the removal of world buffs, but they're still rogues at the end of the day. We'll see how useful they are. I'm reminded, though, of a situation I had on a private server where rogues, yes, rogues, were consistently better because we had higher armor, we could wipe and all that, we didn't have world buffs for every raid. I'm reminded of a situation, though, where rogues could do more damage than warriors, good warriors as well, in, say, Blackwing Lair, when we didn't have world buffs, because there were certain servers where they disabled those world buffs for, let's say, the first couple of weeks or the first week, and then they enable them. Then they allow people to get them. So that's one thing. Rogues will benefit from warriors going down, but so will other classes. Mages, warlocks, shadow priests, boomkins even. I mean, one of the problems with shadow priests and one of the problems with balanced druids and the problems with warlocks and their limitation is the debuff limit. Now, of course, the debuff limit and its removal from Classic Fresh is going to help warriors as well to a certain degree, but the difference between how much you gain as a warrior versus how much a warlock gets or shadow priest gets is pretty significant. So you can expect warlocks to be able to dish out more damage. That's going to have an impact, and guilds will be able to take more warlocks in raids, and they'll be able to do more damage. Though whether or not warlocks will actually achieve higher damage numbers, that's a big question. I think ranged in general, because of the higher HP, maybe introduction of some mechanics that they removed at certain points in vanilla, I think ranged in general is just going to end up in a stronger position than they were in Classic Fresh. So don't be surprised if you see quite a few mages or quite a few warlocks, if you actually see a shadow priest, if you actually see a balanced druid, and not just for the memes, because they might add something to an actual raid that guilds might want. Maybe more the shadow priest than the balanced druid, to be quite honest. I think when it comes to druids, I don't see the situation where it changes, where guilds want to take more than one druid per raid. Sorry to say it, but that's probably not going to change. I could be wrong. We don't know how this is going to shape up. I'm just giving my opinion on what I think is going to happen. And guilds might want to have one druid, one resto druid, or one resto balanced druid, quote unquote. But in some other cases, maybe guilds will want more druids. Maybe they'll want a balanced druid as well. Maybe they'll want the feral. We'll see how that shapes up. Because tanking is going to be changed as well for this. Like, this is going to affect every aspect of the game, what they're doing in terms of HP, what they're doing in terms of loot, what they're doing in terms of mechanics. With tanking, like, obviously tanking, DPS, and healing are all going to be affected. With tanking, I would not necessarily say that protection warriors are not going to go Fury Prot. The reason is because Fury Prot, the reason Fury Prot works is, one, it scales better than Deep Prot, significantly better than Deep Prot. I mean, yeah, Shield Slam scales with Deep Prot. With Fury, everything scales. Even if they double the damage of bosses, Fury Prot might still be the better choice than Deep Prot. Though you might be using a shield a lot more often than you did before. That's one thing. The idea of dual wield tanking is not necessarily going to be on the table. The idea of Fury Prot may very well remain there. But tanks are going to do less fret. Fret is going to be more important than it was in Classic. A lot of people will cry about this. It's going to make the life of a lot of tanks a living hell. It's going to give Alliance an even bigger advantage than they had in Classic Fresh all that. Because you could hold Fret as a Horde player. It was an issue, but you could hold Fret. Like, the whole purpose of Fury Prot was just to be able to hold Fret against the insane DPS numbers that people were able to pull off. But I feel Alliance is going to get an even stronger advantage due to Salvation than Horde will in Classic Fresh. Whether or not that will help their faction numbers remains to be seen, because I think the issue with Alliance, it doesn't matter what kind of advantage or disadvantage they have. At this point, people just don't want to bloody play it because they feel that they're going to get screwed if they play Alliance. But different discussion for a different video. So Fury Prot might still be the go-to thing. Maybe not from week 1 or week 2. Maybe once people get some gear and they can actually use some scaling. The most ridiculous thing I saw in Classic was people going Fury Prot from week 1. That's bullshit. And it wasn't great, honestly. You could do more fret with that gear that people had at very early on. You could do more fret with Deep Prot. It was only like a couple of weeks in, like 3-4 weeks in, once you got some gear, that Fury Prot really became the go-to method of raiding for vast majority of times. Still, some people did play Deep Prot from beginning to end. Whether or not Deep Prot might surpass Fury, I don't know. I'm sure that you're going to see more Deep Protection Warriors than we did in Classic. By the way, this whole discussion about tanking is also something that affects Warriors more than other classes, because Warriors do a lot of fret. And they're doing that fret in melee. And that means that they're going to be fret limited. Now, sure, a lot of DPSers won't care about it, and they'll still push numbers, but that's certainly going to impact the way raiding is, the way guilds approach raiding, the way guilds build their raid comps. I think you would still want, say, 2 warrior groups, like let's say four warriors, a shaman in each on the horde side as an example. I still think you'd want that at least, or maybe even more, maybe even 3, maybe even more. But you would still want a decent amount of warriors. You just won't want them the same kind of numbers. You will probably benefit more from a caster group. In fact, some guilds really did well with full caster groups, even Classic. I think they're going to do even better in Classic Fresh. And, well, that's pretty much all there is to say at this particular point. This is what I think is going to happen in raiding. This is what I think the impact of Blizzard's decisions is going to be with regards to raiding in Classic Fresh. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Christine here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and join the Discord, link in the description.